All right, let me blow your mind for a second. Right after World War II ended, the United States secretly brought hundreds of Nazi scientists to America. Yeah, the same men who built rockets for Hitler were suddenly working for Uncle Sam. They weren't arrested. They weren't put on trial. They were hired, given homes, jobs, even new names. And all of this just to get an edge in the Cold War and win the space race. Sounds insane, right? But it's true. The entire operation had a secret name, Project Paperclip. And without it, NASA as we know it today might never have existed. Now, this isn't some conspiracy rabbit hole. This was a real government program, signed off by the highest levels of power. The same people who said never again after the war quietly stamped visas for men with swastikas on their lab coats. So here's the question. Was this genius or was it betrayal? Did America trade its morals for scientific glory? Because what these men built didn't just change history, it launched humanity into the space age. And the truth behind it all, that's what we're uncovering today. Picture this. The year is 1945. Nazi Germany has just fallen. Hitler is gone. The war that tore the world apart, it is finally over. And while cities across Europe lie in ruins, something strange is happening behind the scenes. In the middle of all that chaos, American soldiers are quietly searching through the wreckage, but they're not just looking for weapons or prisoners. No, they're looking for people, scientists, engineers, men who built the terrifying weapons that nearly destroyed the world. And here's where it gets wild. Instead of locking these men up, the United States decided to hire them. Yeah, the same minds who built Hitler's rockets, the V-2s that rained down on London, were suddenly being handed new passports, new names, and jobs in America. It sounds like a plot twist out of a spy movie, but it really happened. They called it ISIS Operation Paperclip, a top-secret mission to bring Nazi scientists to the U.S., not for justice, but for their knowledge. Because in the early days of the Cold War, knowledge was power, and the race for power wasn't over when the war ended. It had just switched battlefields. You see, while Germany burned, both America and the Soviet Union were already eyeing the future. Rockets, jet engines, missiles, maybe even space. Whoever could master this new technology first would dominate the next century. So the US made a choice. Ignore the past to win the future. And that choice would shape everything, from the Cold War to the space race, and even the birth of NASA. It's one of those moments in history that makes you stop and ask, how far would we go for progress? Would we trade our morals for a head start in science? Because that's exactly what Operation Paperclip forced America to decide. And once you know how deep it went, you'll never look at the space program the same way again. All right, so let's rewind for a second. It's 1945. The war is finally over. Hitler is gone, Germany has surrendered, and Europe is absolutely shattered. Cities are reduced to rubble. Millions of people are displaced, hungry, and trying to survive in what's basically a giant graveyard of a continent. But while the world is celebrating victory, something way less obvious and way more important is happening in the background. The Allied forces, the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union, aren't just fighting over land anymore. They're fighting over brains, German brains. Because even though Nazi Germany was defeated, their science, that was next level. They had built rockets that could fly faster and higher than anything anyone else had ever made. They had jet engines, advanced missiles, and medicine decades ahead of its time. Stuff that looked like it came out of a science fiction novel. The biggest prize of all was the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided missile. It could fly 50 miles up, leave the atmosphere for a few minutes, then come crashing down at supersonic speed. These things were used to bomb London and Antwerp, killing thousands. And yet, for scientists and generals, they were irresistible. Proof that the future of warfare and technology had just changed forever. So when Germany surrendered, both America and the Soviet Union made their move. Each side scrambled to capture as many of these rockets, blueprints, and engineers as they could. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about power. Imagine the scene. U.S. officers raiding underground bunkers, pulling out rocket parts and technical documents, while Soviet troops were doing the exact same thing just miles away. It was like a real-life race, not for gold or territory, but for knowledge. And right in the middle of it all were the men who built these machines, scientists who had spent years working for Hitler, and now suddenly everyone wanted them. One of them was Wernher von Braun, a brilliant engineer in his early 30s, already obsessed with rockets since he was a kid. He led the team that created the V2, and now as Germany collapsed, he and his team knew they had two options: get captured by the Soviets, or surrender to the Americans and hope for the best. Von Braun made his choice. He gathered his team, packed their notes, and made sure they'd be found by the U.S. Army. And that single decision would change the course of modern science, because the Americans didn't just find rocket parts in the rubble, they found the people who knew how to build them. So even before the dust of World War II had settled, a new kind of war had already begun, one that wasn't fought with bullets, but with knowledge. And that's exactly where Operation Paperclip was born. Okay, here's where the story turns from rubble and recovery into something straight out of a spy thriller. After the Allies grabbed as many rockets, blueprints, and parts as they could, a new problem popped up. What do you do with the people who designed them? These were brilliant engineers, but many of them had worked for the Nazi regime. The U.S. had to decide fast: prosecute them, let them fade into obscurity, or recruit them. Enter a shadowy, no-nonsense outfit, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency. Their job was simple-sounding and impossible at the same time: bring in German scientists whose knowledge could give America an edge. At first it was called Operation Overcast, but soon the files of hand-picked scientists started getting a paperclip clipped to them, a small, bureaucratic symbol that became the nickname for something much bigger. Operation Paperclip. So how did it actually work? Think of it like hiring the smartest people from your enemy's tech lab, but doing it in secret. Military officers and intelligence agents would identify teams: rocket engineers, aerodynamicists, rocket production experts, and quietly arrange to transfer them and their research out of Germany. Sometimes the scientists were cooperative. Sometimes they were just relieved to escape the Soviets. Either way, they were given offers: a new life in America, jobs at military bases or private aerospace firms, and in many cases, a clean file. And when I say clean file, I don't mean paperwork. I mean real editing. Documents that tied certain scientists to Nazi organizations or to the use of forced labor were buried, redacted, or rewritten. The goal was to make these men acceptable for U.S. immigration and employment, even if it meant glossing over darker chapters of their past. One name kept popping up: Wernher von Braun. He and his Peenemünde team had practically written the book on long-range rockets. The U.S. grabbed him up, not because someone suddenly forgave him for his wartime role, but because his knowledge was too valuable to ignore. Von Braun and dozens of other specialists were quietly shipped to places like Fort Bliss and later Huntsville, Alabama, where they started building rockets for the United States. Here's the key: this wasn't a handful of researchers slipping through the cracks. It was an organized, government-backed transfer of people and knowledge. Paperclip was about speed and leverage. In the opening days of the Cold War, political leaders and military brass saw a clear trade-off: moral certainty versus technological supremacy. They chose the latter, believing that controlling rocket technology now could save American lives later. And that choice created the complicated legacy we're still arguing about today. The same engineers who once helped build weapons for a tyrant would become central figures in America's push for the stars. But to make that happen, parts of their past had to be hidden, sometimes deliberately. That deliberate hiding is what gives Operation Paperclip its dark, uneasy tone. Because this wasn't just about science. It was about how far a nation will bend its principles when the stakes are existential. All right, let's talk about the people, the actual scientists behind Operation Paperclip. Because this isn't just a story about secret files and government deals. It's about real men who went from working for Hitler to working for America. The most famous name you'll hear again and again is Wernher von Braun. He was the golden boy of German rocketry. Brilliant, ambitious, and obsessed with reaching space long before it was even possible. As a teenager, he was already designing rocket models and dreaming about sending humans to the moon. But during the war, those dreams took a darker path. Von Braun became the technical director at Peenemünde, the Nazi research facility where the V-2 rocket was born. Now, to be fair, the V-2 was a groundbreaking piece of technology, the first man-made object to reach the edge of space. But it was also a weapon that killed thousands of civilians. Each launch meant hundreds of forced laborers working under brutal, deadly conditions in underground factories. And that's the gray zone that von Braun and his team lived in. Scientific brilliance trapped inside a brutal regime. When the war ended, von Braun knew his knowledge was valuable. He made sure he and his top engineers surrendered to the Americans instead of the Soviets. And soon he was in the U.S., not as a prisoner, but as a guest engineer. Then there was Arthur Rudolph. He had been one of von Braun's key production managers during the war, overseeing the assembly of the V-2 rockets. His technical expertise made him indispensable, but his management of forced labor at the Mittelwerk factory later came under scrutiny. Despite that, he was brought to America, where he eventually worked on the Saturn V rocket, the same rocket that launched Apollo astronauts to the moon. Another name worth knowing is Hubertus Strughold, often called the father of space medicine. He studied how the human body reacts to extreme environments like high altitude and zero gravity. His research helped pave the way for astronauts to survive spaceflight. But his story too has shadows, allegations that some of his early experiments were tied to unethical human testing during the Nazi era. Yet in America, he became a celebrated figure, even having an aerospace medical library named after him, until later when his past caught up with his reputation. And then there's Kurt de Boos, a rocket launch specialist who became the first director of NASA's Kennedy Space Center. He was literally the man responsible for launching the rockets that took America to space. Under his leadership, launches became smoother, safer, and more reliable. But de Boos, too, had been a member of the Nazi Party before being brought to the U.S. Here's the thing. These weren't random recruits. They were some of the most brilliant engineers and scientists in the world. The kind of people who could imagine what didn't exist yet and then make it real. Their ideas built the foundation of modern rocketry, missile defense, and space exploration. But it's impossible to ignore the other side of the story. Many of these same men had, directly or indirectly, worked for a regime that committed horrific crimes. And yet, in post-war America, they were given new homes, salaries, and in some cases, awards. The U.S. government justified it with one simple argument. If we don't use their knowledge, the Soviets will. It's uncomfortable, right? Because on one hand, these scientists pushed humanity decades ahead technologically. But on the other, they carried a history that was never fully erased, only hidden behind the classified stamp of Operation Paperclip. So while von Braun and his team were helping build rockets in the deserts of New Mexico and later Alabama, the world saw them as pioneers. But behind those smiles and shiny NASA badges, the question lingered. At what moral cost did America's space dream really begin? Here's where the story gets uncomfortable. We've met the brilliant engineers, the men who could make rockets fly, and we know what they built. But there's a second story running underneath, the way the U.S. handled their past. After the war, U.S. military and intelligence officials faced a brutal choice. On one side, justice, war crimes investigations, public trials, truth. On the other side, immediate advantage, secret knowledge that could jumpstart American rockets, jets, and weapons technology. The decision they made was practical, cold, and consequential. They prioritized advantage. How? In several practical ways you can explain on screen. Files that linked scientists to Nazi organizations were downplayed or cleaned. Investigations into possible war crimes were delayed, minimized, or quietly dropped. In some cases, immigration paperwork was altered, so a man's membership in the Nazi Party didn't disqualify him from coming into the U.S. It wasn't always one dramatic cover-up. More often, it was a series of bureaucratic edits and omissions that, together, did the job. Think of it like this. The government treated information as a raw material to be refined. If a document was inconvenient, it was redacted or refiled. If a biography was damaging, it was rewritten. The goal wasn't to hide forever so much as to make these scientists employable and politically palatable. That's how you go from a lab coat with a swastika to a suit at Redstone Arsenal. Now defenders of Paperclip argued a simple, urgent case. The Soviet Union would snap up these scientists if we didn't. In the logic of the early Cold War, who controlled rocket technology controlled the future. So the argument went, better to have these minds helping America than arming a potential adversary. It's a realpolitik calculation, security now versus moral clarity later. But there's a cost to that calculation. When you fast-track expertise while ignoring accountability, you send a message. Some crimes can be overlooked if the payoff is big enough. Survivors and historians later asked, who pays for that choice? The families of forced laborers, the victims of Nazi experiments, and a public that believed the war had ended with justice. They all deserved answers that weren't given. There are human examples you can read aloud to hammer the point home. Imagine a factory where prisoners were worked to death to build the very rockets that would later be celebrated at American test sites. Imagine those same technicians receiving medals and director positions, while the suffering that made their work possible remained in the dark. That contrast is morally jolting, and it's central to why Paperclip still haunts history. This dilemma also raises a practical question for the viewer. Can technological progress be separated from the conditions under which it was created? If the answer is no, then every scientific advance has an ethical footprint. If the answer is yes, we risk normalizing shortcuts that undermine justice. So when you script this for voiceover, use short, piercing lines to let the audience sit with the contradiction. Ask the viewer directly, would you trade justice for the possibility of beating an enemy to the moon? Those simple questions are more powerful than long moralizing paragraphs. They force the viewer to take a side. Bottom line, Operation Paperclip wasn't just a recruitment program. It was a national choice about what matters more in an existential moment, ethics or survival. And that choice reshaped the face of American science in ways that still echo today. So what happened once these German scientists arrived in the United States? Picture this. It's the late 1940s. Across America, cities are rebuilding, soldiers are coming home, and the country is shifting from war to innovation. And quietly, almost secretly, some of the brightest minds from Hitler's regime are stepping off planes, walking through military bases, and beginning new lives under new names. The same men who once designed weapons for the Nazi war machine are now designing technology for the U.S. military and NASA's earliest experiments. They were sent to isolated military sites like Fort Bliss in Texas and later Redstone Arsenal in Alabama. Imagine it, small-town America suddenly becoming a hub for rocket research. At first, the locals had no idea who these strange German engineers were. They just saw tall men with thick accents going into hangars early in the morning and not coming out until night. But behind those closed doors, history was being rewritten, one blueprint at a time. The most famous of them all, Wernher von Braun, the charismatic rocket visionary who had once built the V-2 missile that rained destruction on London. In America, he reinvented himself as a hero of the space age. Under his leadership, the U.S. Army's missile program took off, literally. His team created the Redstone rocket, the Jupiter C, and eventually the mighty Saturn V, the rocket that carried astronauts to the moon. The same hands that once built weapons of war were now building vehicles of exploration. And it wasn't just rockets. Operation Paperclip scientists worked on everything from jet propulsion to medicine and chemical weapons research. Some helped develop high-altitude aircraft technology, others improved guidance systems, and a few even worked on the early designs that would lead to intercontinental ballistic missiles. Their influence spread through NNSA, the Department of Defense, and even private industry. In a sense, they didn't just work for America, they helped shape modern America's technological identity. But let's not forget, this was more than science for science's sake. It was science tied to power. Every breakthrough, every experiment, every rocket launch was also a move in a global chess game against the Soviet Union. This was the Cold War, and whoever controlled space controlled the narrative of the future. America wanted to be first, fastest, and farthest. And these scientists became the country's secret weapon. Imagine being a general in 1955, watching a test launch streak into the sky. You're not just seeing fire and metal, you're watching the promise of dominance. The rockets were symbols, not just machines. They represented American pride, progress, and supremacy in a world that was split between two ideologies. And the men behind those rockets, once enemies, were now the brains powering that dream. Von Braun, for instance, went from designing terror in wartime Germany to smiling on American television, explaining space travel to millions. He became the public face of NASA's Apollo program, the man who made the moon landing possible. His story alone shows how completely Operation Paperclip transformed history. It's almost cinematic. The villain turned visionary. The man once feared became admired. But if you take a step back, it's hard not to feel conflicted. How did America move so quickly from condemning these men to celebrating them? The answer lies in results. The United States wanted to win in science, in space, in war. And in that race, morality took the back seat. Progress, no matter how it came, became the ultimate justification. By the time the 1960s rolled around, the scientists of Operation Paperclip weren't outsiders anymore. They were national heroes. The rockets they built didn't just reach space, they reached deep into the American imagination. The moon landing in 1969 wasn't just a triumph of technology, it was a triumph built on the paradox of genius born from darkness. So when you see those black and white clips of the Apollo launches, remember, behind the astronauts and the FOWs and the cheering crowds were minds shaped in a very different world. Operation Paperclip didn't just bring scientists to America. It brought their knowledge, their history, and their moral complexity. And it changed the course of human achievement forever. By the late 1940s, it wasn't just about rebuilding or exploring space anymore. The world had shifted, and a new kind of tension had taken hold. The Cold War. America and the Soviet Union were no longer allies against a common enemy. They were rivals, locked in a battle for influence, technology, and global supremacy. And in this tense atmosphere, every rocket, every missile, every scientist counted. Operation Paperclip wasn't just a science program anymore. It was a strategic move in a high-stakes game. The U.S. wanted to ensure that its technology stayed out of Soviet hands. If the Soviets got these brains and blueprints first, America could be left behind, and the balance of power in the world could shift overnight. Think about it like a chess match. Each rocket test, each calculation, each blueprint copied from Germany was a pawn moved on the board. The stakes? Not just territory or influence, but the very future of global security. One misstep could give the other side a technological edge, a faster missile, a longer-range rocket, even the ability to dominate the skies or space. The Soviets were doing the exact same thing. They grabbed their share of German scientists and technology, creating their own space and missile programs. Suddenly, the race wasn't just to rebuild nations after a devastating war. It was a race to control the next frontier. And America knew that without the expertise of these German scientists, it could fall behind. This urgency explains why Operation Paperclip moved so fast and why moral concerns were often pushed aside. It wasn't just about science, it was about survival, dominance, and staying ahead in a world that could erupt at any moment. Every decision, every recruitment, and every rocket launch was tied to the Cold War mindset, one where speed and advantage outweighed ethics and caution. By the mid-1950s, the Cold War tension was clear to everyone. The launch of Sputnik by the Soviets in 1957 sent a shockwave through America. Suddenly, the space race wasn't theoretical. It was real. And the German scientists who had once worked for Hitler were now America's secret weapon to ensure the U.S. could compete. In short, Operation Paperclip didn't just build rockets, it built a bridge between post-war America and a global struggle for technological supremacy. Every blueprint and test flight wasn't just science. It was strategy, power, and the stakes of the Cold War laid bare. For decades, the story of Operation Paperclip stayed under wraps. The scientists had their new lives. America had its rockets, and the public never knew how much of this space miracle came from men who had once worked for Hitler. It was a secret carefully guarded in government files, only whispered about in classified memos and military reports. But secrets like this don't stay buried forever. By the 1980s and 1990s, journalists and historians began digging into the files. Books were published, declassified documents were studied, and slowly the full story started to emerge. People were stunned. The men who had built rockets for a dictator were not just living freely in America. Some were celebrated as heroes of the space program. The public reaction was intense. Shock, outrage, disbelief, you name it. Headlines screamed about Nazi engineers walking free in the U.S., working at NASA, and even receiving awards. Families who lost loved ones during the war couldn't believe that justice had been set aside so quickly. And ordinary Americans were forced to wrestle with a hard truth. Sometimes national security and technological ambition can outweigh morality. Historians like Annie Jacobson, who wrote extensively about Operation Paperclip, highlighted how the program sanitized the scientists' pasts. Reports about their involvement with forced labor, the Nazi Party, or other wartime atrocities were minimized or quietly buried. The government's rationale was pragmatic. They needed expertise to beat the Soviets in the Cold War and to dominate space exploration. But for the public, it felt like a betrayal. Some scientists, like Wernher von Braun, remained public figures, giving lectures, appearing on television, even becoming icons of the space race. Meanwhile, the darker parts of their histories were largely unknown to the public for decades. That tension between celebrated genius and hidden complicity fueled heated debates about ethics, history, and national priorities. In short, when the story finally came out, people were forced to ask uncomfortable questions. Can you celebrate someone's achievements while ignoring the shadow of their past? Is the advancement of science ever worth overlooking human suffering? Operation Paperclip wasn't just a historical curiosity anymore. It became a moral mirror, forcing America and the world to reflect on the choices made in pursuit of power and progress. So, what's the takeaway from all of this? Operation Paperclip didn't just end with a few rockets or a handful of scientists in America. Its legacy is massive, complicated, and still being felt today. On one hand, the program was a technological jackpot. The German scientists brought knowledge that propelled the United States into the space age. Without them, the Redstone, Jupiter C, and Saturn V rockets might have taken decades longer to develop. And without Saturn V, the Apollo 11 moon landing, probably delayed by years. Think about that. A giant leap for mankind, powered by minds that once built missiles for a dictator. These scientists also helped America gain a critical edge in the Cold War. Space exploration became a symbol of national pride, a statement that the U.S. could innovate, compete, and dominate on the global stage. In a sense, Paperclip didn't just build rockets. It built confidence, strategy, and a technological identity for a superpower. But here's the other side. It came with a moral price. The program deliberately downplayed these scientists' Nazi pasts, including ties to forced labor and unethical experiments. That history wasn't erased, just hidden. The very same men celebrated as pioneers of space travel had contributed, directly or indirectly, to suffering and oppression. And by choosing expedience over accountability, the U.S. set a precedent. Sometimes ethics are sacrificed for the sake of progress. So when we look at the space program, the Cold War, or even modern technology that grew from these foundations, we're seeing a story with two sides. It's a story of genius, innovation, and achievement, and simultaneously one of compromise, secrecy, and moral ambiguity. Operation Paperclip is a reminder that progress often comes with shadows, and that history rarely offers clean victories. The lesson? Science and innovation can take humanity to unimaginable heights, but we have to remember where it comes from and what we're willing to overlook to get there. The echoes of those choices are still with us today, in every rocket launch, every technological breakthrough, and every debate about ethics versus ambition. So here's the thing. Operation Paperclip wasn't just a historical footnote. It was a turning point where ambition, morality, and power collided in ways that still resonate today. The same men who once built rockets for a regime of terror ended up building rockets for a nation dreaming of the stars. Their knowledge launched satellites, sent astronauts into orbit, and eventually carried humans to the moon. That's the brilliance. That's the achievement. But it's also the paradox, because behind those triumphs were difficult questions that don't go away. What price are we willing to pay for progress? And how do we remember history when the truth is messy? When you look at the U.S. space program, or even the rapid technological advances that followed, you're looking at a legacy shaped by ingenuity and compromise. Operation Paperclip reminds us that progress is rarely pure. It's often a mix of brilliance, ethics, and hard choices. So the next time you see a rocket soaring into the sky or hear about groundbreaking technology changing the world, remember this story. Remember the people, the decisions, and the shadows behind the glory. Because history isn't just about what we achieve, it's about how we get there and the echoes of those choices that ripple through time. And that's exactly why Operation Paperclip remains one of the most fascinating and controversial chapters in the history of science, war, and the human drive to reach beyond the limits of our world. If this story blew your mind as much as it did mine, make sure you hit that like button. It really helps more people uncover the secrets of history like this. And don't forget to subscribe and tap that bell icon. We've got tons more videos diving deep into the untold stories that shape the world. From science and war to hidden histories you won't believe are true. So stick around, because the past isn't just something to read about. It's a story we can explore together, one mind-blowing chapter at a time.